Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about user services or identity services. And I'm going to get started off in my series here, just doing straight out of the box individual account user services. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a web app, and this is going to be for a fairly broad set of videos that I'm going to do. So I'm going to start off with just doing the web app and talking a little bit about extending the identity framework. So let's get started off by just doing our web app here. Now, quite simply, I'm just going to call this user services. There we go. Okay. And I'm going to place the solution in the same directory. And nothing else really special here. We'll just move along. When we move into selecting the framework, we're going to do .NET 8. Authentication type is individual accounts. We're going to configure for HTTPS. That's just sort of by default makes us use HTTPS, which is more secure by nature. And we're not going to use top-level statements. Now, if you're familiar with it and you're okay with using top-level statements, by all means, feel free. I'm still a little bit of a traditionalist, and I keep with the program CS. So let's go ahead and create our solution here. Now, when we create the solution, what we're going to look at is we're going to start right away by reviewing some of the identity features. Now, what the framework already puts in is so .NET, and if you're familiar with .NET from way back, it's done the same thing forever. So what we do here is we're capturing a connection string from our default connection string configuration, and that comes from over here in the app settings. Now, one thing while I'm here, I'm going to make a change to our database name. If you'll notice, Microsoft loves to put in this wonderful GUID here, and it's not very helpful. So I'm going to do something like this. So just rename that. You can keep the name if you want, but I like to rename it just because it makes a little bit more sense when I'm trying to look at it. And in fact, I'm going to do this here. So I'm going to do DB, yeah, videos DB. And let's just identify that's for my videos. So we'll close up our app settings. And now the next thing that it does is it adds our DB context. All these services are kind of being added, and they become injectable objects. So I'm going to talk about dependency injections later, but first of all, what we're going to focus on here is the DB context being added. Now, the application DB context is pretty straightforward as a DB context. There's nothing in it at the moment. It extends the identity DB context, and the identity DB context is pretty straightforward. I'll show you what that looks like here. And what it is extending on identity DB context. It's using IdentityUser and identity role, and it's using a string as a key type. So that means that for IdentityUser, when it builds the database, it's going to create a string primary key. Okay, I'm going to keep with the string, but we will be changing IdentityUser and identity role. So by doing this, we have to add a few features to our application right away. So let's get started. Now, you'll notice here in this line here, it says default identity, and it automatically gives us the identity user. Okay. Now, what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be extending on the identity user. In other words, what I'll do is I'll add on a feature into identity user, and I'm going to start extending on what a user is in the context of our application. Because identity user is really just basic stuff, things like password hashing, the username, email, really basic stuff. And For us, that's still important, but we're going to be adding a few things that our user can maintain. So let's get started here. Now, when we look to our models, okay, we're going to add a model, and I usually like to add a folder for this just to have a little separation. I'm going to call this folder identity. I'm going to add a class, and I'm going to call this identity models. Spell it right. Identity models, there we go. And in identity models, I'm going to create a application user class. It will extend the identity user. Okay. And I'm going to explain one thing here. Let's just add that to this. So when we look to identity user, we're going to go into what identity user actually is. So an identity user is an identity user with a string as its key. So if I go into a little deeper into identity user, where we identify a key, you'll see down here we have a key as our generic, and that again means that I can specify what type of key we have. So it could be an int, in other words, maybe it's an incremental, sequential, integer. Maybe it's a GUID. We can also make it a unique identifier. And in other words, if I make it a GUID instead of a string, the database will be configured slightly different. It sort of allow for a few different features. So I'm going to keep it as a string for now, just to uncomplicate things. Then let's go back out. So now we're in our application user. So with that, I'm going to keep this model very simple, but I have to do a few things in order to get this our application now to actually use our application user. The first step that I like to do is this. Let's add in our application user class. Okay. And it automatically uses our reference here. Now that's not all we have to do. If I had nothing, and remember here, we're using the template that Microsoft has built. So a lot of the templates are built with the basic features. So in this case, we're using our identity user. So there's a lot of places where the identity user is actually consumed. So if I try to load my application right now, you're going to see that I get an error. And that error is it's a little ambiguous. It doesn't exactly tell you what's going wrong. And we're going to find out what actually is making this happen. So once we have it up, there's a few things that we'll have to do. We'll have to correct one of the partials, and then we're going to have to go through all of the areas and also update those areas. Now, Microsoft has done a really great job at scaffolding all of the error areas for user context, if you will. And one of the problems, though, is that it doesn't automatically recognize that you are extending on identity user. So this first error is caused in this one here is the user manager. So we're trying to use the user manager with a generic of identity user. Now, where is that? Well, it's not very obvious. It doesn't say it anywhere here. So how do I know this? Well, this is just simply experience and having a lot of times where I've had problems with this one. So let's go into the login partial. So this login partial, you'll see here, it automatically starts off by doing the sign-in manager with identity user. And we're going to go application user, add that to our list of references, and we'll just make the change right there too. So let's see what happens now. Now, if everything went well, it should just load up and at least get the startup page. Um, the reason I'm showing you all of this is because by upgrading or extending on that identity user, you can find some challenges in doing that. And that's what the purpose of this video here is for, is to get past all those challenges and understand why you're having them. They're fairly straightforward, but they can be confusing. So now we have our app up and running. If I click on register now, um, we have a pretty basic um, looking thing here, the user registration page. I'm just going to use the passwords that Google is suggesting for me, and I'm going to click register. There's going to be an error here because we haven't set up our database as well, nor have we set up the application DB context correctly. So we're going to go through that as well. You'll see here, it knows that we're looking for an application user class, but it doesn't know what an application user is in terms of the application DB context. So let's go into the application DB context. When we go there, what you're going to see here is that application DB context extends identity DB context. If I go into identity DB context, you're going to see it extends identity DB context with identity user, an identity role, and a key of string. So what does that mean for us? Well, in our case at the moment, what we do want to do is we can extend by simply adding our application user. That's the short form of this, okay? We don't have to think too deeply about that. So that's our first version here, and we are going to extend a few more on this. But what this means is it's taking the generic of TUser and placing it here. We're keeping identity role at the moment, and we're maintaining string as our key, okay? So let's move into that. Let's see what happens here. Now, what this is going to do next, because we haven't created our database, we haven't updated our database in any way, it's also going to give us an error about migrations. And I'm expecting this error. If it gives me something else, then it's all more fun, something more to think about. But let's just see here. We're going to do some different passwords there. Suggest a strong password. There we go. Just give me something. And we're going to go register. Now, one thing to note as well, our confirm password is slightly different formatting as our password. And that seems to be a bug. It should also be a password field, so maybe we'll fix that later, but not right away. So here's what it's saying here. It says that we haven't run the migrations yet, so there's no database. I could apply the migrations, but I'm going to use the Package Manager console right now. You can also, if you're more familiar with the .NET CLI, by all means, go right ahead and do that. So what it's asking here is that we just go through the Package Manager console. So I'm going to do that. And that's fairly straightforward. All we have to do is update database. If you're not familiar with migrations, we will be using them throughout the video, so you'll sort of get a handle on how to do the basics of migrations. If you'd like to see a future video on that, please feel free to say something in the comments. I'd love to get some suggestions. So let's do an update. This will apply all of the features of the identity models that we talked about. So with that, you'll see that it's gone off and created some tables. Let's just go through this. So we have a database. That's the database name we gave it. We have, next, let's see what else we have here. We have a table. We have our EF migrations history that tracks all of our history for migrations. Still referring to EF migrations. And what else do we have? We have ASP.NET roles. So that stores all of our role models here. And then we have our users. That's the one we're going to focus on right now. Our role claims, user claims, and we'll talk about those throughout the videos as well. Talk about where they're used and how to use them. And then we have ASP.NET user logins, user roles. We will be getting into these as well. And then user tokens. Okay. And then it sets up several other indexes that are on all of these tables too. Now, where are these stored? They're right here. So you can look at that that migration anytime. You can understand what it actually accomplished. I find this really helpful. A lot of times, if I'm maybe upgrading an application, going from say .NET 4.8 to 6, 7, 8, even anything higher than 4.8, has a different schema for the identity tables. So this is really helpful to understand what does it actually need to create its new schema. So now that we've understood that, we will run our application again. Okay, we have our application up. So let's go into our register page. Now I'm going to do a register on my email again. Let's just go ahead and throw a password in there. And we'll do a register. Great. Okay, now I'll just do an update password, why not? So from this register confirmation, we have a link here that's automatically set up within the register confirmation area. I can click here to confirm my account. So I just do that, and I'm pretty much ready to go. So if I click on login, I have a login page. It's already got my login information here. Let's go ahead and log in. So we can log in without any trouble. It automatically knows that I'm using my application user at this point. Now, there are some areas, and we aren't going to run into them quite yet, but there are some areas that will require that I update those areas and scaffold them differently than they already are. But I'm going to go into the basics of how to update our application user now. So when we go into our identity models, let's do something like this. What I'll do is I'm going to say that the user has many. Let's consider a situation where they're working for many companies, or they have worked for many companies. Maybe something like a resume. So let's consider that as an option. So we're going to start off by creating a collection. I want to call this company, and then we're going to create company in a minute. So I'm going to call that companies, and we'll just use a hash set as our start point. Company. Great. Okay. Now let's just create the file here. I'm just going to generate the class within here just to keep it very simple. So company will have an integer. Actually, I'm going to make this. Yeah, let's just make this a string, and this is going to be the ID, and we'll give this a name. Okay. I'm not going to get too complicated. I won't worry about create date, edit date, and all that sort of thing. But what I will need is a reference to our application user. So I tend to like using the foreign key columns, so I will do something like that. I will say, I'll do this. User ID is my foreign key, and that's relating back to my application user ID, and I'll explain this in a moment. Then we have a navigation property of application user, and I'm going to call that user. Okay, so now our object in company is set up to understand that for every company there should be a user, and for every user there should be companies. Fairly straightforward at the moment. So by doing that, what we now have to do is we have to modify our DB context to maintain a table of companies, and then we're going to do some configuration as well, so that we tell Entity Framework how best to use our companies. Okay, so let's add a table here, and this will be a DB context, or DB set, excuse me, and that will be company and companies. Pretty straightforward. Okay. I see what happened. Sorry, put it up in the wrong spot. So this is where we do our options configuration. So we will be doing some of that later. Now, so we've got our data our DB set here in our data context. By doing that, that means we're now going to have to do a migration. So we're going to do an add migration, and we'll do add companies. So what that'll do here is that will create a foreign key for us. It'll create a table of companies for us as well, create an index and all the rest, and you'll see how it affects our migration. And we're going to upload that or push that to our database. So here we have a companies table. It has the ID that we talked about. It has a name. It has a user ID. And let's see, then we have our primary key set up. We have a foreign key that relates to our ASP.NET users table. And then we have an index as well that's set up for user ID as well. Now, there's one thing that that must happen, and that is that in order for ID to generate a GUID in this case, I'm going to be using GUIDs. I prefer GUIDs over just simply using an integer. What we want to do is we want to do default SQL value, and we're just going to simply do this, new ID. Now, if our data type was unique identifier, we could use a sequential ID. Sometimes in a lot of cases that's a great idea, probably could be used in this case, but I'm going to keep things a little more simple, and I'm just going to have it generate a new ID every time we create the item in the table. Okay, now I'm going to go back over to our companies, and oops, forgot to run an update on our database. Let's just stop that for a moment. Okay, so we'll do update database. Great. So now our database is going to have a table named companies. And I wonder if we can just connect through here. Let's just see if we can. Should be able to. We have, yes, there we go. So if I go here and look at the tables, should refresh, And there we have our companies. Columns should be right here as well. There we have it. So we have our ID, our name, and our user ID as our foreign key. Super simple. All right, so let's go back into this and we'll just start working on extending what that means to the rest of our application. So go in here, just make sure that everything is still working. And we should be in good shape. So you can log in. There we have it. So now we have our company's table linked to our database. How do we actually use this now? Well, let's add a controller here. So we're going to add a controller, and we're just going to call that companies. The company's controller. And I'm going to use just the out-of-the-box framework here for creating controllers. We'll get it to generate all the views. It'll be called companies. Nothing special here. We'll just do an add. Okay, so now what we have is our companies controller. So when we load up our companies, at the moment, it doesn't really have a whole lot of stuff in there. It'll just be some basics, but let's just find out what it actually gives us. One thing that I want to do, because we're really trying to aim for identity services, which sort of implies the level of security, is at the moment, companies simply brings every company for every user. That's not ideal, and it's very unlikely that you'd be using that in any kind of production environment, unless, of course, it's for something that is specifically for an admin user, but we won't get too deep into that. So here's what we have here is our index page. It's quite straightforward. At the moment, when I do a create user, it sort of automatically has created a drop-down list for us with the GUID of our current user. It's implying that I have to create an ID for that, which isn't ideal as well, and then create a name for a company. So there's a lot of things that really kind of don't make sense at the moment. So let's understand what we have to do to make this work. Now, when I look at the create view, it's saying that it's just by default, it's giving us a list of users that we want. So I don't really need that. Okay, so we're going to go into that view, into the create view. And there's a few things that we really don't need. We obviously are not creating an ID, so we can remove that form. And we're not going to be selecting a user. That would be bad if I wanted to just say I'm going to create a company and apply it to anyone on the database. It's not going to be quite right. What I want to do is I want to use the claim principle and grab the information directly from the context of the user. So I will be doing that in a moment. So now that we've taken away some of those features, we can just save that. And what we have to do next is we have to address the post side of the create. So I don't want someone to send in the ID, and I don't want someone to send in the user ID as well. I can, however, accept name, so no problem there. If I wanted to be basic, I really could just put string instead of company, but let's assume that there's going to be a lot more features for company at some other point. So now with this, you're going to see a very basic way of doing this. We're going to get into something much more deep at some point, and this is how you generate a GUID very, very basically. I'm just going through the really simple ways, but I'm going to show you how the professionals do it later on. Right now, I'm just simply showing you simple stuff. Now, you're going to ask, well, how do I get the user ID, Chris? Well, here's how we're going to do it. You'll notice that there is a user object and a user ID. So one of the things that I love about .NET Core is that I can inject different types of objects. I'm going to use, in this case, I'm going to use a user manager, and I'm going to use UserManager to grab the user for the current user, and I'm going to always be working with just the current user. So I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to go User Manager and ApplicationUser, and we'll just go with the suggestions. I'm going to add that as a field. And we'll see here. Now, one thing I always like to do with fields is I will underscore just to indicate that it's private. So with that, we're going to refer to User Manager every time we're asking for data about the user objects. That way, we're always working with, in this context, you'll see how this works out. In this context, we're always working with the user, not querying the database based on a assumed user ID. So here's what we'll do. So I'm just going to do var user, and we're going to do user manager, and this is actually a async function that we're going to use. So we're going to do get user async, and I'm going to use the user claims principal. So with that, now I can do this. I'm going to do user.companies.add and company. I've got this ID in the wrong space, so I'm going to put that up to the top, just above, and there we have it. By doing this, I am now in the user context. So I have a user, I have a companies. From that companies, I can add in the company that I'm adding, and it will always be related to the user that I found here. Okay. Now, you might be asking, well, Chris, what if there isn't the user found? You're going to add a few other error checking, and we'll get to that. But right now, we're just going to straight up say it's always existing. So if we have a current user, it means they're logged in, hopefully. If it's not logged in, we're going to get an error. So let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. Now, as we build this application out, you'll see that I'm using the user manager. What I want actually to do later on is we're going to build a user service, and this user service will be a unit of work type of object, similar to a DB context, but a DB context in this application DB context, the way it works, application DB context says here's wide open database. It just you can query it for anything and it'll give you back anything that's in the database. What we want to do is secure that one level over, and we want to say, okay, I have a user service that is only related to user related objects. So that's going to be our next effort. That won't be in this video, of course, but the goal is to show you some of the basic stuff, and as we build this out, you'll start to understand a little bit more. So let's add ABC Corporation. Let's find out what it does. Now, you'll see it kind of sprung back there, and all of a sudden it didn't work. So what happened here? So I'm going to put a debug state here, and I think that something is invalid in my model state. So we'll find out what it was. So it says my model state is invalid. Let's find out what that model state error is. And you're going to see that we have an invalid ID, we have a invalid user, and we have an invalid user ID. So in this case, just for a moment, we're going to just ignore some of those errors. So what we can do is just take away some of those errors because they're not really all that important. So at the moment, we're going to do to take away name of company ID. Okay. We're going to do this a few times. Now, this is obviously very inefficient, and we will get to some way better ways at another point. So let's find out what it does now. Okay, we'll go into our companies, back to create new, ABC Corporation, and go add, and now we should have, yes, we have a valid identifier as true. So we'll go continue. And now what it says here, object reference not set to an instance of an object. And I know exactly what the problem is. I'm going to go back into my company for just a moment. I made a mistake here. It didn't make this virtual. Okay, that's one problem there. And that's probably going to be one error that's that doesn't need to be there anymore because it's a virtual object. It'll just be disappeared. In fact, just so we know that, I'm going to put a breakpoint just before I start removing the errors. Do ABC Corporation again. So, what errors do we have before we lose this here? I think. Oh, no, it's still seeing the same user as invalid, but I'm not going to worry about that at the moment. We've removed them, and now we have a valid user state. Let's find out what it says here now. Do we have are we actually logged in? We're not logged in. So that little error that we thought that wasn't going to come up is here already. So what we probably wanted to do, either way, we can make this work, but we have to do this. We have to do authorize. Okay. And all we have to do to make that work is just put that little authorize attribute. And of course, every time we go into companies, it's going to automatically ensure that we're logged in. Let's just force it to tell us that too. So it automatically brings us here, go there, log in. Now we can create our ABC Corporation. Let's do that. Great. So now we have our ABC Corporation in our database. At the moment, our details page is very simple, and it still is working with the whole database once again. So we're going to do the same thing with index and details. So let's go up to our index. So if you remember here, we use this. I'm going to copy that little bit of code. We don't need anything in terms of using the data context anymore if we're going this way. Basically, the user manager is similar, I guess, to like a repository pattern. So what we're going to do is we're going to do user companies, and I'm just going to call this entities. Okay. And this does not have the async method anymore, so we can take away that. Now, what this will do here is it's going to bring the user companies. However, if there is any kind of problem with getting the entities, what we're going to see is it will give us a problem here. Now it has no entities. Let's find out why. So let's go into our database and find out where that little bit of information went to. And I just want to view data right there. So we have a user, and good. So we have all the information there. So what's happened? Well, what has happened here as well is, I believe I didn't mark this as virtual either. So let's find that part. That's another thing. You have to just remember putting virtual in here, and I forgot those things, so I apologize. So now we've got that stuff in there, we're going to try running it again and see if that was the problem. Basically, the concept behind entity frameworks is that objects that are marked as virtual, they can be filled if they need to be filled, but if they're not that way, then they won't be filled. Okay, log in, find out again. So now, one of the things that you saw earlier is that it still didn't work, but what I want to do in our options is add in the ability to pull in to use basically use lazy loading. And I can do that in two different places. I can add it by doing override in the configuring. Okay, now I can add it here. I can enable the proxies here, or I can do it in the program CS. Now I tend to like to do it in the program CS just to keep my database context clear, but I have to do a little installation first. So I have to go to dependencies, and I have to do manage NuGet packages, and we're just going to look for proxies. So we're going to be looking for adding the Microsoft Entity Framework Core proxies, and we just hit do an install from there. By doing that, it will allow us to load our proxies lazily, if you will. So I can do something like this, use lazy loading proxies. I can do it like that, and there's nothing wrong with doing that at all. That should work, in fact, in our context. But I'm also going to show you in the program CS the way that I prefer doing it. Again, I like all the configures to be in the program CS whenever possible. Okay, just log in. Okay, so now, because we included the companies, what that does is it basically says, instead of eager loading those proxies, it says just wait until I actually ask for it. And in this case, we're asking for it, so it does go out and ask for the specific thing from the database. So it does need a company, and in this case, it also needs user. We don't actually need the user, but in this case, it's adding it. So once again, if I decided to throw in yet another company in, I now have company 2. All right. So what this also means is that now that I have an index, I was going to say something about the program CS. So this here can be configured here. That's fine. I, again, tend to prefer going with the program CS approach, which means that I can add it right here. You can just chain these together, and it tends to work just nicely. I do like it here because it keeps all my configurations in one place. At some point, as you build out bigger applications, you will start to extend the services collection and start adding on your own configuration methods. That way you can configure everything off to the side, and you'll know exactly what you're configuring in that point. So here, by using lazy loading in this way, might as well just go ahead and test it one more time. And go to companies, log in, and there we have it. We're still up and running with our lazy loading without any trouble. Now, what happens when I click on the details? Now, details is one more view that is also important because it will equally be calling from the just the straight companies database. Now, there's problems with this in that if I send in a GUID that happens to match someone else's user company, I can now see that other person's company, see any details in that. So I don't really want that once more. So I'm going to reuse my code over here once more. Okay, I'm going to use that UserManager get user, and once again I'm going to use the user companies, but in this case I'm going to be asking specifically for one company, and rather than calling it company, I like to call it entity just for generic purposes. And let's see here, we're going to do companies, and you'll see down here is looking for a first or default. That is absolutely correct. So we do first or default where ID equals ID. Now, what that means now is that if I have, if that company happens not to be in the database under that user, it won't find it. And that's what we want. It should return a not found if it doesn't exist in the user's list of companies. So let's find out what happens right now. Again, if all works fine, we should be great. We should be able to pull up a user with a GUID that is in the user's list of users or list of companies. So we'll go here again. Click on details, and there we have it. Okay, so that one worked. You can see, of course, if I just change that, that's what happens there. We got a page not found. And this is something here that's a really good lesson. Learning how to get information from the user is really key. It's a very common aspect of working with the how the user interactions work. Now, right now we're just using the user manager. In my next video, I'm going to build a user service that actually strictly works with just user objects. Okay, so when we actually need to use those objects, we can call them and very easily query with a lot of strictness and security. So we've got our details done now. We've done our create. We also need an edit. Okay, so to edit, we never want to be able to edit the ID. And in this case, I'm never going to let someone edit the user as well. So we're pretty much the same view as our create, which is interesting. There's some value in creating a common partial view for create and edit. So oftentimes it will create a create edit view between those different actions. So from here, once again, we are going to be calling the user from UserManager. Now, it would be safe enough to say that context.update probably should work, but in many cases it's not going to work because we're not sending in ID or user ID. Because we're not sending those two in, they're both going to be null. That means that update is going to be failing because it doesn't have an ID, but also it's going to set user ID to null as well, so it doesn't know what user this relates to. We're only allowed to update company in this context. So first, what we want to be able to do is we want to pull the correct company. As I said, we're going to call this an entity because it's coming from the database. So if it is null, we're going to throw just a new exception. Let's just say not found. Okay. And that again, because if I threw in an ID that was invalid, then I don't want it to. I don't want to be able to just update any old ID. I want to make sure that I actually have the correct from the correct context here. And you'll notice that I'm loading from context. I want to be loaded from companies, and once again, we are going to use our first row default. Oh, actually, created my query here. Okay, so from that, I'm going to be pulling the entity, and I can update that entity with the new information that's coming from the company. So company.name, you see this will get very inefficient quickly, and it would be horrible to have if I had a huge object and I had to put every single attribute that could be updated on that. That can be really tedious, so bear with me while I make this change here. But what we can do, some of the cool things here is that we can, with UserManager, instead of doing update, I can do update async. Now this does a little bit of magic here, which is kind of cool. And it also handles save changes. I could also have done that up with my my create. It would have worked just the same. Effectively, it works the same way, but I'm just showing you a slightly different method of doing that. So let's see if we'll just make sure that we've got everything correct here. And I think we do. We also, if you recall, up in Create, we had a few errors that we're going to remove, and I'm taking the easy way out here at the moment just to get rid of the errors, but we'll find out what they are. Now, we won't get an error for our ID because we already know that it's there. Just close everything up here. Okay, so go back. All right, so let's find out what happens here. Actually, we do have a few fields that we have to manage over here. We don't need, this is in our edit view. We don't need our user ID. I think that's it. You'll notice here that the ID is a hidden field as well, so we're good in that respect, and we can move along. So let's load up and find out what our edit does now. Okay, so let's edit our ABC Corporation. Okay, 1, 2, 3, we'll call it. There. Now it's saying that my page is not found. Let's find out why. It's most likely one of those little things that I did here just to kick us out. But let's find out what it has done. This. Here we are. So this is an interesting thing that Microsoft has done. They're saying company exists. ID, and they're trying to use company.id. What we're going to use is ID up here. So we're going to debug through this in just a moment. And actually, now that I think about it, it's saying that we need to bind ID because it is actually checking up here. Is the ID not equal to company.id? Now, I don't like doing that at this point, and yet it's not a bad idea to do that because I could just send in any old company here and not have it comparable to the ID that's here. I'd throw in any old ID here, and the two don't match, and maybe there's an error, and I just sort of skipped over some flaw in my my API. So let's go back into that again. Okay, we'll log in. Okay, let's do the edit. Okay. 1, 2, 3, click save. So far, we have a good model state. We have a user. And if all goes well, we have an updated entity right there. Again, we'll click here. We have a good details. All good. Great. Now, finally, we're going to look at the delete side. Okay, so once again, details and delete are very similar to the way the get method works for create or edit. It's saying ask from the companies that the user owns, and we will I will go off and just use what the current user has. So here, I'm actually going to copy this code right there. That's exactly the code that I need for my delete. Right there. And I can just paste it right there, and I should have no problems working with this. Now, while I was scrolling past, I recognized as well that I missed the edit feature. The same goes true for edit. It's exactly the same code. We'll see. Okay, and I'll test this as well, just so that you see it when we pull it up. So let's go back over to our delete. So this page here, it just simply goes off and says, do we have this ID? Is there an ID? Do we have a user? Do we have the company in the user's company based on that ID? Yes, we do. Let's go ahead and view it. So let's now just double check that all of this is working. Okay, here we have our companies list again. Check our details, looks good. Delete, looking good. Edit, looks great. Excellent. So, delete. Now, when we delete this at the moment, this page is working because it works very similar to the details page. However, once again, the next step in delete is the delete confirmation. So we don't want it to just up and delete any old ID because we can't actually tell it to do that at the moment. As long as that ID exists in the database, it will go off and delete that item, and we don't want that. So what we need to do is we're going to follow some of the same patterns here. Okay, we're just going to remove a few of these things. Okay, I'm going to take, there we go. So let's walk through this again. If ID equals no, it's always a good idea to just double check that and throw a not found if it doesn't find it. We'll look up the current user, ask for the current user's companies, and check to make sure that we actually have that entity. If we don't have that entity, we turn not found. If we do have that entity, we are going to remove it. And you'll notice it's using the context again. We don't necessarily want that. So let's do this. Users.companies.remove, and we're going to remove the entity. Just for sake of using, oops, for some reason it keeps closing me out of my controller when I save. New version of Visual Studio, of course. What happens here is it does a save, and then it will update the current user once again with the deleted function here. Now, you'll also notice we have this company exists. The best thing to do here as well is we can throw in this little feature, and right there, and oops, hang on a second, I'm going to pull in the user manager. Now you're probably noticing that I'm using this user manager quite a bit. It makes sense to put that into an in-memory object that you can just keep calling from, so that it doesn't ask for companies every time. It should already have it in memory. But in this case, we're going to use it twice. So with that, it's asking for, do we have any user companies? And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So just copy paste that, move that code, and we should be good to go on correcting that company exists, because it is used in a couple of places. One in particular is right here, and we can just do that. Violate spot. Good. Good. Okay, now going back to our delete. So we're going to try to do a delete on our company's table. If all goes well, this should just do what it's supposed to do. Okay, go to our companies, log in. So let's delete our ABC Corporation too. So we'll find out what happens here. Click on delete, and now you see that it's deleted. So pretty straightforward at the moment. What we have now is we have a company's controller that handles all of the CRUD operations in the sort of standard way of doing things. One of the things that I'm going to work on my next video is I'm going to show you how to decrease the amount of code. You probably noticed that I was cutting and pasting the same code over and over and over, and that's not very efficient. So we want to try to reduce some of those lines of code. Think about it like this: the more lines of code you have to manage, the more difficult your job as a software developer gets. You do want to try to work to minimize the amount of code that you use. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like it and you want to see more, please comment. Give me some ideas for my next videos, and we'll get a whole new series going. I like this one here. I think that we're going to keep expanding on it. The next video, as I say, is going to have unit of work for specifically for a user service, and we're going to work with a repository pattern as well for any of the additional objects that relate to the user. Thanks a lot, everyone. Remember to like and share. Bye bye.